Hello, everyone, and welcome back to DOGE Watch, where if you give us just a few minutes out of your day, we will give you all of the highlights on what has been going on with DOGE for the previous week. And this one is going to be a little bit frustrating because the Supreme Court has just issued a 5-4 ruling against DOGE specifically, and we're going to go to our trusty source here at Ground News and look at the Supreme Court denies Trump administration request to cancel $2 billion in foreign aid. Now, let's dig in a little bit deeper to find out exactly what happened, because the problem with this is the 5 justices, with Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Roberts siding with the 3 liberal justices, essentially told the Trump administration that they have to unfreeze $2 billion worth of aid that they had identified as being potentially, let's just say, fraudulent or wasteful. Now, we don't mean fraudulent in the legal term. Let's just say maybe not in line with what the American people would think we were spending foreign aid on. Now, what's interesting is that it wasn't just an issue of whether or not this is the proper jurisdiction of the executive branch to be able to freeze this funding. Justice Alito actually dissented and wrote a pretty interesting question here. Does a single district court judge who likely lacks jurisdiction have the unchecked power to compel the government of the United States to pay out and probably lose forever $2 billion taxpayer dollars? The answer to that question should be an emphatic no. But a majority of this court apparently thinks otherwise. I am stunned, wrote Justice Samuel Alito, who was joined by Justices Clarence Thomas, Neil Gorsuch, and Brett Kavanaugh. So what's the issue here? What could possibly be the justification for telling the executive branch that they have to engage in what they consider to be horribly wasteful spending? Well, this comes down to an issue of separation of powers. Now, for all of us who love the Constitution, we generally respect separation of powers, and we understand that within the Constitution, Congress has the ability to write the budgets and get the budgets approved. Within those budgets, they can allocate funding for specific purposes. Now, the executive branch, once it's been signed, once the budget goes into effect, the executive branch has the authority and, in fact, the responsibility to be able to distribute those funds in accordance with what Congress has allocated and to do so in a faithful manner to what the subject matter was. Now, what the Trump administration was pointing out with a lot of this aid is that what the American people probably thought it was going to was everything from, curing diseases or feeding hungry people or building infrastructure or whatever else it might have been, ostensibly within the interest of United States foreign policy. But what DOGE has been repeatedly uncovering is that millions, nay, hundreds of millions, and in fact, possibly billions of dollars have been going to any number of ridiculous and ideologically pushed agendas such as DEI, LGBTQ, etc. Again, things that are at best are questionable. Now, you could make the argument that if Congress had specifically allocated funds to be spent on those purposes, it would be the duty of the President of the United States to faithfully execute those payments. And that appears to be kind of the nebulous claim that is being made here. I am a little bit skeptical, and clearly I'm not alone. The 3 other members of the Supreme Court, namely the most conservative ones, also thought that this was highly problematic. But this begs the question, what do we do now? I mean, is this it? Can we just expect the Supreme Court with the 3 liberal justices and maybe 2 occasional moderate ones on the court siding with them in order to essentially and effectively shut down what DOGE is trying to do? Well, it's possible, but there's a couple things to take into consideration. One, DOGE has actually analyzed and identified about $100 billion of what they're categorizing as, at the very least, wasteful spending, and in some cases, potentially even fraudulent, or maybe even falling into the case of abuse. Now, the president has the authority to freeze that spending in place, which is to say that the president can determine that this is not a faithful execution of what Congress has determined or allocated through the budget, and so it keeps it there. That doesn't mean the president can just simply say, oh, I don't like how that money is being spent at the Department of USAID. I'm going to pick it up and move it over to another department. And the reason why he can't do that is because obviously we don't want a situation where Congress can do one thing, the president can take the money and then do whatever he wants with it. But that's not what President Trump was doing. As mentioned in the court case, he was freezing that spending, ostensibly to take a look at whether or not this was really what Congress wanted it spent on. But the court appears to kind of jumped in and decided, no, we've decided it is what they want it spent on, so go do it. Now, we have a couple of questions about what can they actually do to combat this. Now, The president is obviously very excited about what DOGE is doing. In fact, if you watch the address to the joint session of Congress last night, he actually listed out several cases of DOGE finding spending that I think most Americans would consider to be absurd. And in fact, if you look at recent polling, most Americans do consider to be absurd.
$40 million to improve the social and economic inclusion of sedentary migrants. Nobody knows what that is. $8 million to promote LGBTQI+ in the African nation of Lesotho, which nobody has ever heard of. $60 million for indigenous peoples and Afro-Colombian empowerment in Central America. $60 million.
But I want to take this a step forward, or a step further, because last week I had the privilege of actually visiting the White House along with other people and being able to ask questions of various members of the administration. We got to talk to the White House press secretary. We got to talk to Vice President J.D. Vance. We even got a little bit of time with the president, although we weren't asking specific questions about policy of him. He was having a busy day. But we did get to talk to other people within the presidential cabinet. And one of the questions that I posed to the White House press secretary and others was the executive branch's commitment to getting things done with DOGE, not just from the executive standpoint, but also from the legislative. And that's where the second part of this comes in. We've known from all along that there's only so much the executive branch is going to be able to do with respect to freezing funds or issuing executive orders or relying on Schedule F in order to freeze hiring or even fire members of the executive branch that they don't think should be there. But eventually, it's going to require the legislature. Now, this begs the question. If we know the Trump administration is absolutely adamant about not only DOGE continuing to do what it's doing, but to be even more aggressive, where does the legislature stand, and specifically the House of Representatives? Well, we can go to people like Thomas Massie, and he doesn't leave any question about where he stands. Thomas Massie tweeted out, "The solution to this problem is obvious. Congress must quit sending the dang money to USAID. Republicans now control the House and Senate, yet here we are facing a vote on a continuing resolution next week that would fund everything in 2025 as it was funded in 2024. Thomas Massie is bringing up an excellent point, and there's no doubt he wants to cut government. Now, I have heard from another member of Congress that is actually a little bit concerned that the slim majorities that the House Republicans currently have doesn't give them the sort of buffer that they feel comfortable with in order to pass the sort of sweeping changes that many of us want to see from the legislature in support of DOGE's efforts. So, lo and behold, just this morning, right after Trump's speech to the joint session, I had an opportunity to sit down with Speaker Mike Johnson and ask him the question, how committed is the legislature to actually codifying the things DOGE is doing within the first 2 years? Because I'm going to be honest with you, anybody that's been in politics for a while is used to being disappointed. If you've been involved in Republican politics for a while, you're constantly used to hearing, well, we need the House and the Senate and the presidency and a favorable court. And once we have all of those things, now you're telling me we still need more? And that's what I wanted to hear from Speaker Mike Johnson. What was his commitment? Now, I'm happy to say that I had barely got through the question of setting this up, of saying, Speaker Johnson, there are some people that are concerned that you don't have large enough majorities to pass this sort of substantive or sweeping change with respect to DOGE. Do you? And he stopped me and he said, no, we have to act within the next 2 years. But then he did something else that I actually really appreciated. He started to articulate what this process looks like. And he listed 3 things: quantify, qualify, codify. And what he meant by this is that there is a joint responsibility here between DOGE and the legislature. DOGE has done an excellent job utilizing the various tools that they have in order to analyze and identify potential fraud, waste, and abuse. Now, when you look at the overall numbers of that, that falls into that categorization of quantify. Now, when it comes to qualify, Elon Musk has already said, look, we're not always going to get it right, but we promise we're going to go back and fix it whenever we don't. And so there needs to be a process both where DOGE and outside entities and members of Congress can look at potential spending that DOGE has identified and then determine whether or not it's something that really needs to be cut. That's the qualify portion. Now, once you've quantified and once you've qualified, then it's time for Congress to act. They actually have to submit legislation or budget amendments or whatever else it might be in order to ensure that that money is no longer being spent the way that at least 5 members on the Supreme Court have decided it must be spent. But Congress has to act very quickly in order to achieve that. Otherwise, Billions of dollars will continue to be lost. So, do I trust him? Well, I know a lot of us were frustrated, myself included, with what was going on with the continuing resolution before Trump was sworn into office. In fact, it was one of the cases where we saw X being used exactly the way we wanted to be used. And that was to get information out to the American people quickly in order to influence members of Congress to not take a bad vote, completely contradictory to what we just voted into office with respect to the Trump administration. And it was effective. Now, I will say this. I tried to give Speaker Johnson an opportunity to give maybe the sort of answer that I wouldn't have wanted to hear. Now, I did that not because I'm a reporter. I'm not a reporter. I didn't go to journalism school. I went to a school where I learned about analysis, and a lot of the questions that I had to ask of people was when I was conducting combat operations in Iraq. So I learned how to ask questions very carefully in order to give someone an opportunity to give me the sort of answer I actually didn't want, but would tell me something about what their true intentions were. So I actually considered it to be very positive that Speaker Johnson actually cut me off and explained exactly how the House was going to go through the process of making sure that they were holding up their end of the bargain when it comes to making sure that DOGE's efforts are actually successful, not just in the short term with executive orders, but in the long term with legislation and codification. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to watch. I'm going to do what Reagan suggests. I'm going to trust, but verify. Because here's the good news. The way the House of Representatives works is if the Speaker wants a bill to disappear somewhere, it disappears. If he wants it to get to the floor, it gets to the floor. I think we have an overwhelming number of members that want this sort of legislation to be able to come to the floor, to be able to get voted on, so that we can make sure that money is not being wasted by the bureaucracy. But that's what it's going to take. It's going to take that level of commitment and speed. Now, I'm happy to announce that we're actually going to have an opportunity here in the very near future to talk with the chairman of the DOGE committee in the House of Representatives, Congressman Pete Sessions. And we'll be asking them about some of the processes that they plan to use in order to expedite legislation when necessary in order to address things that come up through the courts. Because this isn't the last time we will see a court, especially lower courts, essentially try to strike down or thwart what DOGE is trying to do. Now, I think we should be fair and intellectually honest and consistent. If there's a freezing of funds that has been clearly allocated and articulated within the budget to be spent in a particular way, then yes, it may be that that money has to be spent. But Congress has the opportunity to come in and correct for those mistakes, and they must if we're actually serious about this. And one of the things that we have to stress repeatedly here is this. You don't have 4 years. You have 2. Because one of the things we've been promised year after year after year, decade after decade, is that if only conservatives had a Republican House, a Republican Senate, a Republican president, and a generally friendly Supreme Court, then and only then would we finally get some of the structural change that we want to see. Well, guess what? You got it. You got it. The Trump administration, from where I'm sitting, is doing absolutely everything they can to be creative and to be aggressive, but to operate within the boundaries of the Constitution. They're fulfilling their responsibilities to the executive branch. I was very encouraged to hear what Speaker Johnson had to say today, but time will tell on whether or not all the members of the Republican caucus are as equally incentivized to do so. And we will continue to follow up with members of caucus to ask them what the plan is. Now, we're going to focus on the House right now, but that doesn't mean we forgot the Senate because they play a role in this as well. And we are already setting up meetings with members of the United States Senate to talk about this very process. Because here's the bottom line. A lot of the things that we wanted to talk about this week actually highlighted some of the corruption that we're seeing, not just within the bureaucracy, but within NGOs. And I promise you, we're going to get to that in a later episode. But with this latest Supreme Court decision, with the president listing out everything that DOGE was accomplishing, or a lot of the things DOGE was accomplishing in the joint session of Congress, and because of our recent opportunities to be able to talk with members of the White House and Speaker Johnson, we wanted to emphasize exactly how this process is going to be going forward right now. This is the first episode of the Empire Striking Back, and now it's time for Congress to step up and fulfill its responsibilities. Once again, thank you for joining us on DOGE Watch, and we'll see you next episode.